Hi, Amadeus.
Hi, Sandras.
Today we will speak about your piece, IMY, ILY. The first, maybe you can explain the title of the piece and why you choose this title.
So the title is spelled IMY/ILY, which is sort of text message abbreviation speak for I miss you, I love you. And it really kind of has nothing to do with the piece per se, but it is something that I started sort of texting people I was, close to and fond of. It's a kind of millennial affection, sign of affection, words of affection, something that I think maybe it speaks to a kind of intimacy between friends and between lovers. I think that was new to me at the time, around 2016, 2017, because I am pretty guarded as a person. So maybe I chose it because it signifies a kind of openness and a willingness to share a kind of intimacy with someone. And so, I think it ties into the piece in that way. And in that this piece communicates a kind of intimacy. So that's the title.
Okay. And can you just, who commissioned the piece, right? And from whom it was written? Two questions.
Yeah.
Right?
So
who it was written?
Yeah. So this was written for the percussionist Andy Meyerson, who is one half of the new music duo, The Living Earth Show, and they're based out of San Francisco. And they've worked with a lot of different composers very closely with, the composer Raven Chacon, with Sarah Hennies, with Ellen Fullman. So their mission is really to be a vehicle for a sort of diverse set of voices and composers. And so Andy attended a concert of one of my pieces, and afterwards came up to me, and I knew who he was. He's sort of prominent. The ensemble is prominent in the Bay Area of California, so I knew who he was. But he came up to me and asked me if I wanted to write a piece. So I said I was interested, but we would have to get to know each other a little bit, and so and this ties into the process of the piece. I don't know if you want to jump into that, but I mean, basically it was maybe 9 months of hanging out and talking and having breakfast and going to shows together, basically becoming friends before I even wrote a single note.
Yeah.
And this piece was written specific, not necessarily his skill, because he's a virtuoso and can play anything, but for his personality, which was very, driven, enthusiastic. We're both gay, we're both queer, so that was a huge aspect of this piece. There is, in the queer culture, there's I was going to say undercurrent, but it's more like an overcurrent of openness in terms of sexuality. So so we got to know each other, and then I started writing the piece. And when I say I mean we. We wrote the piece essentially together. He wouldn't say that, but I would say that. It was really like, I would write 4 bars, we would go over it, and then, I would write 4 more, or I would write a section and then we'd go over it and then I'd revise it. And you can't really see the score, obviously, but it's different kinds of notation. It's a fully written out, but there's some text directions, so it's partially a text score. It's a hybrid between text score and written notated score, and then also figuring out the notation for it was a big part of the collaborative process.
And what is the main message of the piece, right?
So it's in a lot of my work, because it's become, especially this piece, as is the case in many pieces right now, it's become identity based. So whenever you get into these questions of identity, it's necessarily pretty messy. It's complicated, but there are a few themes that are pretty apparent. And if you're talking about what does this piece communicate, there are obvious things this piece communicates, but they all kind of mix together. So like one of the concepts was, so it's a piece for, I should say that it's a piece for solo bass drum. Both Andy and I come from punk rock scenes, different punk rock. I mean, punk rock means so many different things, but I come from sort of like screamo and hardcore, and he comes from hardcore also, but more straight ahead. He comes with, God, if he watches this, he's gonna kill me. But like, we both come from that sort of more underground scene, and we're both drummers. So it made sense in a way to choose the bass drum as an instrument. But it's treating the bass drum like a body, as a separate body. So it's, in a way, it's a duet between Andy and the drum, but at the same time, it's an extension of Andy's body. So it's the relationship between a performer and their own body, but it's also a piece about the relationship between two bodies. And so it's a way of bringing together and the pushing apart of these two bodies, but also like the bass drum as a signifier of certain traditions, whether it's from a rock position or a Western classical tradition. So it's sort of the mistreatment or the manipulation of these sort of historical relationships as well. I mean, the most obvious sort of concept is one of eroticism. There's a lot of gestural and material symbolism in this piece, but it's not necessarily about sex. For me, it's mostly about power.
Yes, right. It's about power relationship between two.
Yeah. I mean, it's and implicit in power is consent. And in our conversations, me and Andy, we talked about virtuosity in contemporary music and performance practice in contemporary music, and how oftentimes a composer asks performers to do often the impossible, right? To really push themselves to play these nested tuplet rhythms, or to perform really awkward physical gestures on their instrument. And so we wanted to highlight that and make that sort of very prominent in the piece, and really sort of shine a light on the power dynamics of the composer and the performer. So it's not necessarily about sex. It is erotic and it is sensual, but it really is about power, in the same way that something like BDSM or other kink practices are essentially about power.
Yes. Is it like, what is the role, right, of this BDSM element? Because I saw that there are parts where you're even beating, right?
Yeah.
With two hands, right? What's the idea why you use those? And
Yeah, so that
Because you're using
is
this language, right? As I understand.
right. Yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. There were a lot of reasons why we, I mean, in a way, it was a playful nod at different mallets. You know how you ask percussionists to, no, I want a bass drum mallet. No, I want a hard yarn mallet, or I want drumsticks. Um, Neither Andy nor I are very subtle people. We're very, in a way, strong personalities and very open in various aspects of ourselves. So in a way, it was a playful nod at that, but it was also yeah, no, it was an obvious sort of signifier for these power dynamics, and really brings to the foreground um, this element of self-flagellation in terms of what performers go through to prepare a piece, the discipline that goes into training, as a musician, as a composer. So they're not so much, again, they're not so much signifiers for sex, but they're signifiers for the extreme discipline that goes into training in Western classical music and contemporary music. But yes, very obvious, not subtle. And so, yeah, I mean, as symbols, they point to several different things. Like I said, it's a
So,
sort of messy combination of
yes.
meanings.
So, do I correctly understand that there was some critics between of teacher and how it's called, teacher and practitioner, so and somebody
Yeah,
who learns, right?
yeah, I mean, it's the dynamics in art practice and contemporary music are very they're everywhere, they're pervasive, but they're never really spoken about except over coffee or at dinner. But it's we sort of take all of these power dynamics in our tradition, in our culture, in our community for granted.
Got
And
it.
in this piece, I wanted to say, no, these things exist. They shape the music, they shape the performance practice. Um,
And it shaped personality as well, right?
yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's, I'm, it's, uh, yeah, no, you're right. What was I gonna say regarding personalities? I mean, basically, I mean, there are certain types of personality types in contemporary music, when you go to festivals and things. Different kind of composers are different kinds of ways, and a lot of that has to do with their training and where they were trained and who they trained with, and how they were trained.
Got it. And what kind of sensorial experience, right, you wanted to build for watcher of this piece?
Yeah, I mean, from a I mean, there were, of course, for me, there are two parts to this. There's like kind of like the experiential, phenomenological, affective kind of
Yes.
experience, which is um, not only um, which is the more interesting one to me, which is listening, listening with your eyes, listening as watching, listening as feeling. Composer Pauline Oliveros, she would say, when she spoke about deep listening, listening with your body. Um, and yeah, and I mean, when you go to a rock show or a dance and you go to a club, oftentimes you're feeling the music through the subwoofer, through the speakers, and you feel it in your body. And I wanted to translate some of that to the concert stage. So for me, that's usually in my music, what I want to, the kind of listening experience, the sort of more visceral listening experience, rather than one you have with your ears. But, you know, I'm a trained composer, we work with sound. And so, you know, there are influences of, you know, composers, like older composers like Sharina or Lachenmann, where they really train you in their music to listen in this way that, you know, to really listen acutely to the smaller sounds. And so I wanted to create different sort of listening experiences in the same piece. So there are moments where this piece is very quiet, you have to kind of lean in, and then it's loud and you have to lean back. So it's, you know, the relationship between the sound is also a physical one, between the audience and the performer.
Got it.
Yeah.
So right, there is a sound, and so there's some performance, right?
Yeah.
And some visual, right?
Yeah.
It's
yeah, it's a sensory circus, which is, it's a kind of spectacle. And, you know, I think spectacle and, you know, over the top and too much, you know, I think that is kind of like if we're going to talk about a kind of aesthetic, it is a kind of queer aesthetic, you know, in the tradition of camp. It's not as fun as a lot of camp, but it does draw in some ways from that tradition.
If you would take out, just imagine. Can you imagine the piece without performance? Without those, right?
Right, without just, you know, as a recording,
yes,
you mean?
yes, or very well dressed, right? Not
right.
naked. Could you
Not
imagine?
naked, yeah.
It would be the same piece, or?
That's an interesting question. I think it relates also to a question about transportability, in that, like, could someone else perform this piece? You know, not everyone. If this piece is performed by someone else, like a percussionist somewhere else, that's not Andy, you know, they're not necessarily going to strip down. Although maybe they should, you know, I mean, you know, Globocar has Corporel, you know, the piece, and, you know, most people, not most people, but many people, you know, want to sort of affect that, that kind of physical vulnerability. But to answer your question, I think it would still work. It's a little funny. It would maybe actually, like, read as being slightly more strange and absurd, rather than kind of create an atmosphere of, you know, serious critique, or, you know, serious, not that it has to be serious, but, you know, I mean, it does have a really heavy connotation to it. So someone playing it in a suit or a tuxedo, I think it would work, but the constellation or the complex of meanings would be different. The piece would be different.
Okay, got it. And can you imagine, let's say, the same piece, but but without sound, only as performance?
That's a fun question. Yeah, actually, I think so. You know, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and we spoke a little bit about, you know, the other composers who work in this way, you know, like Jesse Marino or Winnie Huang, and very, very interested in that work, because you know, the way I wrote this piece is not necessarily from a sonic or a sound point of view, but from a gestural one.
Exactly.
You know, it's a lot of for me personally, my practice has moved from very strong, bold, sort of musical gestures, fully notated or orchestrated, instrumental gestures, to very physical ones. And I think certain gestures carry as much meaning or more meaning, physical gestures like movement of the body, than sonic ones. So yeah, I think this could be a purely visual piece, or as Winnie calls it, non-cochlear music, which I think is a really interesting phrase.
Okay, yes, got it. Got it. And what is it? Okay, no, what is dramaturgy of piece, right? So it's 15, 17 minutes long, right? Piece.
Yeah, I mean, it's about, so we've performed it a few times, and because some of it is text-based and sort of not fully written out, it varies. The shortest it's been, I think, is about 16, 17 minutes. It's been as long as 25 minutes. And, there are moments in the piece where it says, in the score, and we've decided between me and Andy, it's like, do this gesture, repeat it as many times as your body can handle. It's never, necessarily ad lib. It's always based on like where you are physically. It's an exhausting piece. So I guess going back to one of your earlier questions, one of the concepts behind this piece is one of endurance, physical endurance. The other similarity between me and Andy is that we're both athletes. We played sports, and we did sports our whole lives. So we both come from this place where we have to push our bodies. And it's the same as musicians. So one thing we worked on when we developed this piece were the proportions, how long things take. So in a way, if you're asking about the form of it, it does kind of have a very sort of traditional form. It's a sort of an introductory ritualistic beginning that is all text-based. It starts in this very quiet, very kind of meditative space, and then it builds, and then it builds, and it keeps building, and then you get to a climax, and then the climax keeps going. And I really wanted that sense, that sort of kind of late Xenakis kind of thing where, it's this extremely loud physical music for, 6 minutes straight. And so I wanted parts of the piece to be that. So, the dramaturgy, I would say, really sort of, I wanted the piece to frame the moments where these kind of violent gestures just keep happening over and over and over again for prolonged periods of time. And so, sometimes before a performance, I'll say, okay, Andy, because he's a performer too, so he's like, do you want me to do it 30 times? Do you want me to do it 20 times? So sometimes, in performances are like, why don't you aim for 30, repetitions of, whipping yourself and hyperventilating. But if you can get to 40, I think it would really push the so-called dramaturgy of the piece in a different place, but I understand also if you're exhausted and you're tired and it hurts. That's the push and pull of consent.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the dramaturgy is one of endurance. It's one of pushing yourself and pushing the piece. past the point of fatigue, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how your collaboration with Andy, how it influenced the piece
Oh,
or
yeah.
shaped the
I mean,
piece?
yeah, no, I mean, I spoke about this before, but I mean, he's a very rigorous performer. There are moments where, for instance, just from a practical standpoint, we were working on the notation. And I had a kind of a clumsy notation for right hand, left hand, for different rhythms. And there was a day where, for 3 or 4 hours where we sat down with paper and, we were figuring out these tuplets, these rhythms, on very sort of rigorous level. And it was funny because he's like, it's more complex than it looks, the rhythms. He's like, this is how we figured out Ferniho, So so in a way it was good to get that feedback from him, that but also like I said, I would write a section and then we perform it, and then we'd step back and decide about dynamics or what was possible, typical composer performer stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it was all very it was all based on his personality and our dynamic. Also, he likes to work really early in the morning, and I mean, I'm not awake, really mentally awake, until like the afternoon. So in a way that kind of affected the dynamic too, because he was very alert at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., we'd meet at like 7:30 in the morning. And so when we're talking about push and pull of the relationship, he would push, and because I was so sleepy, I would say, that's fine.
Got it.
So yeah, so even things like that, I think, had an impact on the composition of the piece.
And what kind of software you used for the piece, right? Sibelius, I don't know.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I became extremely proficient at notation software. I mean, my other pieces, sometimes I'll use a graphic notation, sometimes I'll use a graphic and regular notation. Sometimes I was taught and I learned from experience and talking to other composers. And I mean, this is obvious, but the notation serves the piece. So I usually start to do everything by hand. So it started out as a kind of graphic notation. But I mean, we transferred it to Finale. And at one point I thought like a piece like this could benefit from sort of a dynamic lighting situation. I am interested in doing. It's funny, like we talked before, like my relationship to technology is fraught and minimal. But I have worked with technology, and I am proficient in certain forms of technology. But oftentimes, again, like notation, the concept usually comes first, is the most important thing. And so I was like, oh, maybe we can have, I mean, you'll notice in the video that there is a single stationary light underneath the bass drum. I was thinking, there'd be other lights and you can control it gesturally and all this stuff. But it's like, no, I mean, strip everything away to like what's most essential. And then go with that. So in this piece, there's not technology in the sense of sort of digital technology. There are more sort of basic elemental kinds of technology at work, I think.
Yes, I noticed. And what you learn, right? What is your three main learnings through that piece?
Uh, um, you know, I learned a lot about how I want to work and who I want to work with. Um, and I think for me as a practicing composer, sort of developing new projects, I think that's sort of the most important thing, is finding a process that really kind of serves your ideas. Um, and so since then, my work has been more and more specific in terms of the individuals that I want to and do work with. I knew that already, but I mean, oftentimes I feel the pressure to like, write pieces that can be played everywhere and that can sort of travel and do things. But I find that like more intimate connection with a performer is, I think, yields the best results. Um, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about, because like I said, I was a percussionist, I was a drummer. For me, in all of my work, rhythm always comes first. It's like the idea that Stravinsky won the 20th century.
Yes.
um, so I learned a lot about my relationship to rhythm, how to notate it clearly for a percussionist. Um, when is a rhythm actually complex? you know um yeah, so technique wise, I learned a lot about that, but mostly it was about my process and how I wanted to work
And how do you want to work? Right.
and how I wanted to work,
Yes.
how I prefer to work
Yes. How you would
now.
prefer to work? No. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what is the question, right? Yes. How you would prefer
Oh,
to work?
how do I prefer to work?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, I prefer to work um in this way, in this process that develops over time. you know um yeah, composers don't really get anything done unless there's a deadline. um it's a shame because and when I say a lot of composers, not all composers, it's a shame that sometimes to build a kind of and I hate this word, career, you have to produce at a certain pace, metabolism, but to really take the time, as much time as you need to develop a piece, I think is how I prefer to work. And so, right now, in this moment, I'm in a situation where I can take all the time I need and I can choose the projects that I want, because I'm not really worried about, you know, a career or a career trajectory. I'm very content about where I am. So I guess what I learned the most is just about um this is gonna sound stupid, but like basically how to build a life as a composer,
Mhm.
in a way that is outside institutions and outside the pressures of the of the sort of the expectations of what a composer is, in Western music. Um, to just take the time you need to develop an idea, to realize a piece the way it's supposed to, regardless of deadlines or, um, anything else. So, I mean, that's how I prefer to work.
Good. And the
Yeah.
last question, in this piece, right? You choose you extend sounds with performative elements, with BDSM elements, etc.
Mhm.
What would be your suggestion to other composers who would like to use uh, the same language, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's also a good question. Um, I mean, I feel like this question gets to this idea of artistic honesty, a kind of um, integrity, it takes a lot of self-reflection, and self-awareness and self-possession to work with this kind of material. I would say that you would need to have a kind of courage, I think, to approach this material as musical material, these kinds of ideas, because they're not easy, they're complicated, they can be misunderstood and misconstrued. So being very, brave in yourself and in your experience, but also be very careful, I think. Not careful like you'll mess it up necessarily, but very deliberate, careful in like, I want to place this thing on the table so that it doesn't fall over, you have to be very specific, I think, in a way that you don't have to be with a pitch. If that pitch is F sharp rather than G, the whole world doesn't fall apart, the whole piece, the whole form doesn't fall apart. But if you're not careful with the gesture, with a very strong extra musical meaning, then you can bring in different meanings, and your intentionality and your intention can be misunderstood, and it can create all kinds of different meanings than the one you intend. Not that the composer's intention means a whole lot anymore, but you know what I mean. It's you have to be sure.
Mhm.
You have to be sure of yourself and of your materials and how you compose with it. And so in that way, it ties back into this idea of taking time. Yeah, that's what I would say in terms of like the theatricality of the piece, but also like the sort of charged sexual erotic charge of the material itself. It's tricky.
Good. Okay, thank you very much for this interview.
Yeah, thanks, Andres.